Today, we'll be talking about my project called Donors Through the Decades, a historic analysis of cadaver ledgers in the Midwest from 1911 to 2000. So kind of be walking through a little bit of history, a lot of bit of history. So we'll start off. So cadaveric dissection in medical schools has long been the foundation of teaching not only anatomical sciences, but also of humanistic values through students' interaction with the donor as their first patient. So the procurement of bodies for dissection in the United States hasn't really been simple, and it's shifted from grave robbing to the use of unclaimed bodies in the 20th century to consensual body donations, which remains the sole source of the supply today, at least in the United States. The shift occurred within less than a century, and there were a lot of things that went on that sort of nudged this shift. And so there were a lot of cultural shifts through legislative changes, population demographic changes, scientific developments, and the spread of mass media, and all of which have changed the perceptions and rituals of death in America. And so the history of how bodies were acquired for dissection in the 20th century is not super well understood, and the discovery of a unique data set here at KCU sort of helps aid some understanding of this period just as a little piece of the puzzle. So anatomical dissection was actually previously considered to be more frightening and undignified than capital punishment itself. It was viewed as a desecration of the corpse. It was believed that it would impede resurrection and deny the survival of identity after death. So it was pretty bad. Execution was a threat to one's life, and dissection was an assault on your soul. And in this way, anatomical dissection historically was practiced for a mixture of both medical as well as punitive reasons. And one could be sentenced to death for their wrongs, but particularly bad crimes meant the addition of dissection. Sorry. Okay. So there's a little brief timeline of what's going to serve as our outline for today. The presentation today will not give all the detail of all the happenings during these times, but hopefully gives us a little bit of background information leading up to the time period of our data set. So at the end of the 18th century, US governments realized that we needed a dramatic legal change in order to effectively end the practice of grave robbing. And grave robbing, I think that the term is quite self-explanatory, but it was the acquisition of bodies by going out to a freshly buried grave and then digging it up. And Massachusetts was actually the first state allowing unclaimed bodies to be used for dissection. And over the next couple decades, many other states followed suit, and so new legislature was put in place that unclaimed bodies of people who died in hospitals, asylums, and prisons would now be allocated to the state's medical schools for the purpose of dissection. And due to these laws, the price of illegally obtained corpses declined, and now grave robbing was neither profitable nor practical, so that went out. And these laws were acclaimed by medical schools because now they had a steady supply of bodies for dissection, but also by local governments who were previously responsible for burying unclaimed bodies. There were also a lot of social or societal proponents who were enthusiastic about this idea, especially the idea that criminals and paupers who were once a burden to society could now, quote unquote, do something with their lives. So this solved the problem of grave robbing, but people still didn't really like the idea of dissection. So what actually changed the public opinion? And what's actually funny is that the fact that dying became so expensive is what changed people's opinions. In the 1960s, embalming, the science of embalming sort of became a thing. It became popularized, and that led to an increase in open casket funerals. There are three particular, just very amusing works of journalism published during this time that highlight this. Notably, in 1951, Bill Davidson writes, "The high cost of dying." He wrote that the cost of living had increased by 347%, but the cost of dying had increased by 10,000%. In 1961, Raoul Tunley writes, "Can you afford to die?" And he included a quote from a president of the Funeral Directors Association saying that if we Americans have a high standard of living, we also have a high standard of dying. It's the American way. And finally, Jessica Mitford's book, The American Way of Death in 1963, was the first compilation of statistics that described sales scams used by funeral directors, talked about price fixing within the funeral industry, and how to avoid paying exorbitant funeral costs, one of which was to donate your body to science. And at that time, there was actually no legal property value in a body, but one could donate their body if there was no next of kin that refuted this. She also compiled, again, for the first time, a list of schools that would have accepted donated bodies, which was previously not information that was readily available. So, while the fear of dissection discouraged donation, the fear of being victimized by funeral directors also made people reconsider body donation. And all of these things move the needle towards dissection being maybe not the most awful thing ever, but now we also ran into the issue of bodies needed being outnumbered by the number, or being outnumbered by sorry, that unclaimed, yeah, the number of bodies that were needed were now higher than the supply of unclaimed bodies. And this is because of a lot of other events, such as the Great Depression, which led to changes in welfare, changes to better healthcare for the poor. And then now Social Security had to pay for a lot of funerals. So there were no longer enough unclaimed bodies to meet the supply, so something else had to happen. And this is when the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act steps in. This is from the National Conference of the Commissioners on the Uniform State Laws. And in 1968, they officially made body donation a right, which was morally based on free choice and volunteerism. And what this did was it changed donation by establishing the human body as property. And I think that is an interesting concept because I feel like in modern days, and especially when we sort of talk about ethics, we don't like to view individuals as property. However, in this time period, viewing an individual as property was what gave an individual right to what happened to them after death. And yeah, and some other events that I mentioned. So I mentioned some other events that changed American society's attitude towards body donation, but some other ones included the World Wars, which softened public opinion about donation, and people thought it was more okay to give their lives or give their bodies, since there were so many people giving their lives for their country. And there was also a gradual religious reception to dissection and organ donation. Cremation was also on the rise, so there was less emphasis on the sacredness of just the inviolate and intact body. So all of these societal changes, or with all of these societal changes, people didn't really have to worry anymore that if they did donate their body, that society would label them as a criminal. So what's the issue? So when we do a deeper dive into who were the people in particular who were either had their graves robbed or were the unclaimed bodies being used, I want us to take note in each instance the population at risk. So the graves likely to be robbed were those who were of poor or unprotected members of society, oftentimes African Americans. And so during the time of grave robbing, it required that their graves have security. And they couldn't afford security, so they were buried with less care. And for the most part, society kind of looked the other way with regards to grave robbing, provided that bodies continued to be procured mostly from the poor and marginalized segments of society. And after the shift of use to unclaimed bodies, modern critics actually say that under the new laws, the same marginalized part of the population was still being subjected to dissection. And most people in society still view dissection negatively. And this sort of leads into our data set. And something I want to point out is that, especially when we're doing a historical project, is that decades of use of unclaimed bodies became normalized within societal contexts. And there was even legal legitimacy. There were anatomical acts that allowed you to use unclaimed bodies. However, one thing I want us to remember is that legal legitimacy does not equate to ethical legitimacy. So knowing this, we're going to prepare to jump into our data set. Hopefully we have a little background knowledge and have some similar hypotheses in mind for what trends we might see in the data set, which spans the 20th century. And right before that, though, why do we care? Why does this matter? So why is it important to be cognizant of demographics of body donation programs? And one might argue that it's anatomy. Under the skin, we're all the same. And indeed, that's objectively true. However, what we hold to be obvious now does not garner the same consensus in times past. And unfortunately, the fact of history that we must accept is that especially in this country, differences in demographic used to mean anatomical differences and sometimes even moral differences. And thus, I bring up the guiding ethical principle of justice and how it comes into play in the management of body donor programs. So defining justice as the distribution of benefits and burdens in society, it follows that body donor programs should be cognizant of whether donations to the program reflect the demographics and socioeconomic status of the region that the program serves. And additionally, I draw upon some similarities touched upon by the common rule in ethics. And what this is, it used to be called the Federal Policy for the Protection of Human Subjects in Research, and it's a set of ethical guidelines for research involving human subjects. The justice aspect emphasizes that vulnerable populations should not be disproportionately burdened by research and that potential benefits are shared equitably. So now we have an idea of all of this, and we're going to move into the 20th century, which helps, and this data set will hopefully help to fill in this little gap in the literature. So our methodology. Last year, the Anatomy Department offered several cadaver ledger booklets to the library for preservation purposes. These were handwritten documents beginning in 1911, when medical education depended very heavily on cadaver dissection for anatomy education. Within these registries included donor name, age, sex, race, cause of death, where they were received and where they were distributed to, and these were all recorded into SPSS in order to analyze trends, and graphs were created using R statistical software. In total, we had 4,131 donor records that were analyzed, and demographic analysis was conducted based on age, sex, race, and cause of death, but today we'll mostly be focusing on sex and race. The dataset was also analyzed for comparison with population census data in Missouri in order to compare our demographic makeup with the local population. So some of our results. To the left, we see a bar graph showing proportions of females to males, with males in orange and females in purple. So we went from 10% of females in the first couple decades and saw the biggest jump defined as the difference between time periods in 1961, where 33% of bodies were females. And then after that, we see a sustained upward trend of the proportions of females. And while we cannot draw causality from the data, I think it is interesting to note that we see the biggest jump within this time period, which we know is when body donation and willing your body was in the talks before it was passed as a uniform act. And I think that this can lead us to wonder whether there is a sex difference when it comes to motivation to donate one's body. On the right is a line graph showing some proportions of individuals by sex and race. So Black males, females, white females, and white males were the most abundant, which makes sense given the Missouri locale, followed by Black males. Then the lines for Black and white females do this little bit of an interchanging dance, with Black females outnumbering white females most of the time. But then interestingly enough, white females increasing in number again around the time of these acts. And you'll see an unfortunate drop-off in the data after 1970, and I can tell you that's not because we suddenly stopped doing dissections. We'll discuss that later as a major limitation of the project. So when we look at this graph again on the right, we saw that white males vastly outnumbered other groups, averaging at around 60% of the data set. So given the earlier part of this introduction, you might think, well, maybe white men were the poor and marginalized group targeted by grave robbers, because that's what the data sort of at face value shows. And that's not to say that they weren't. However, looking at the data at face value in that way loses a lot of context for interpretation. And for that, we must look at what the population makeup was in that time period. So this next graph is a comparison with Missouri census data, which interestingly enough, if you go far back enough into the records, they were grouped differently or grouped in different files based on your race. The lines with triangles on the extremes of the graph show the proportion of Black and white individuals in the population census, and the lines with the dots in the middle of the graph represent the data set. And here is where we sort of see the truer meaning of the data set. In our book, Medical Apartheid, Harriet Washington speaks about the disproportionate use of Black bodies in medical research. So disproportionate to what? To the number of Black individuals actually living in a population. And the graph here really reinforces that point, showing fewer white individuals being used for dissection during this time period and more Black bodies being used. And this is where the drop-off gets really frustrating because we don't get to see the change in the data set with the changes in attitude towards dissection. So that kind of brings us to our limitations. And as with any historical project relying on handwritten records, we're unsure of how complete the data set is. Again, records drop off after 1970, yet it's unlikely that it's due to the lack of cadavers. Also, if you can count on humans to do one thing, well, first of all, it's to die. But next would maybe to be like mess up and make mistakes. So who knows if records that were analyzed were duplicated or omitted. And lastly, unfortunately, there are very few data sets like this, and institutions typically do not have um, historical records of demographics in these records, which means that comparisons and further analyses are not currently possible. And again, in conclusion, understanding historical trends like this really informs current day practices of how to best ethically implement body donor programs. And while our data did drop off where it did, if I were to hypothesize, I would be inclined to say that this is one of the many contributors to medical mistrust within the Black community, and that Black individuals are less inclined to donate their bodies. And personally, I'm a believer that anatomical dissection is a privilege that, when properly used and implemented, teaches you a lot more than just anatomy. The first patient narrative really has become so much more popularized now, emphasizing that anatomy lab is oftentimes a student's first intimate interaction with death. And it references that this experience sets a foundation for empathy or apathy if the donor's humanity is not reinforced for the student as they progress within whatever career they choose. So here we speak about the medical career. And I think that there is a tremendous value in an ethically conducted body donor program. And with that, I'd like to leave us with a reading of a letter, which was written by a donor who gifted their body to the KCU Gift Body Program. So I think this is a lovely letter that really shows us, again, the value about an ethically conducted body donor program to both the students and, in a way, to the donors themselves. So I'm just going to read a little snippet of the end. And this was right after she signed up to be a donor. So she said, "It was all done, and I felt so peaceful, a peace that transcends all other peace. And then I began to wonder, what would those students find in this body of mine that I didn't know about? Would they find something that even my doctors hadn't found? Or would it be all the things that had bothered me all the time, but never really caused me to slow down? I wish I could be a little elf and sit in a corner and watch as they took that first knife in their hand, a little bit nervous and scared. I would like to be there to tell them, don't worry, you're not hurting me. You're learning so that someday you can proudly practice medicine and know that in the end, I beat the odds. I left two things that, even after my death, I could still truthfully say that I was still able to help someone who needed help. My life will not end the day I die. So with this in mind, how could I be anything but peaceful? Happy that the decision was made and happy that all the paperwork was done. So as you work on me to learn, do not mourn my going. I have had a full, good, and blessed life, and I am happy to be able to help you. Learn all you can so that you can help others who need you. Now, if someone just doesn't mess up and forget that I gave me away so that others could have more life, maybe God will take care of that for me." And that is my presentation.